Yeah, okay, that's it.
Good morning, everybody. You would have thought that after a year of working on Teams and Zoom, that we'd have the ability, the gene that enables us to unmute ourselves. But it seems that most of us regularly forget that, however competent we are with such digital technology. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation today, and when I was asked to talk about this kind of theme, I thought in a way that this is something that modern family life is, for several reasons, something that has kind of been an interest of mine for some time. And why I think it's been an interest is because I thought there's various pieces of my own story, and I've summarized them in the screen in front of you. And to give you a kind of few snippets into my own family life, and it's probably as varied, rich, and complex as many of yours. So a few pieces of background about me. I come from the UK and I moved to Belgium in 2001. I'm now a Belgian citizen as well as a UK citizen, and actually that's great for me because I actually think that Belgium have a better football team than England now, and so that's one of the reasons why it enables me to have two chances in the World Cup. Um, um, I'm working, as Eleanor said, as the Director of Advancement at the International School of Brussels. I've been doing that since 2005, and a lot of my time there is spent helping families choose the right school and being part of a team that is oriented towards helping families choose the right school in Brussels. And many of those are local families as well as international families moving to Belgium. In terms of modern family life, in 2010, I actually published a series of stories and reflections on modern family life, and I guess in a way it was a way of writing as a form of therapy, as I look back on my own upbringing, and also thinking about what it is like to be a dad in today's world. To be a dad where we went through things like IVF and kids with different kinds of reasons to celebrate, but also difficulties, and in fact other aspects of modern family life like breaking up and divorce. So in my distant past, I did a PhD in philosophy. I was a priest in the Church of England, a psychiatric chaplain and an academic. I taught in a couple of universities in the UK and spent a lot of my time writing and reading Soren Kierkegaard and thinking about how truth is learned. So, that's a part of who I am as well. I still write mainly about the future of learning. I'm learning to make jam. I'm trying to run, but at my age, it feels like that's one of the things that time may run out in the end, for me to really become a good runner. And maybe one of the things that I'd say probably most important things is, I have 6 children, 5 of whom are biologically mine, 6 children in our family right now, and have been married 3 times. My wife, Christina, is Romanian, and so we are a recomposed family. And as you can imagine, with 3 children living at home, 3 children grown up, and we have a complex kind of family life, and I think that story is not unusual. And many of you might think, oh goodness me, that makes my life seem a bit simpler. But I also know that many of us have complex family lives, and that's one of the things that the realities of the modern world. So contrary to what Eleanor said, I would actually preface everything here in terms of saying I actually don't think I'm an expert in any of the following. I don't want to give the impression today that I'm an expert in being a good dad. Most of the time I don't particularly feel like I'm a very good dad. And there are good days and bad days. There are moments when it feels like everything comes together, and a lot of moments where it definitely doesn't. I wouldn't either say I'm particularly an expert in managing COVID-19. I communicate a lot about COVID-19 to people within the community of the International School of Brussels, but it doesn't make me an expert. And I think I'm sitting here like every one of us trying to manage a crisis, not only for the organization in which I work, but manage it personally and dealing with all of the personal situations and emotions that gives rise to. For example, like being estranged from my own kids who are in England, and I haven't seen them for over a year now. And I'm certainly not an expert just because I work in a school with all things education. And so things like helping kids with their homework, it's pretty clear to me that with two 16-year-old twins, their mathematics is well beyond my ability to remember anything mathematical. So I'm not going to give you hints and tricks as to how to sit down and help your kids do their homework today. And one of the things that it feels to me that we're dealing with today is trying to understand what is the story of modern family life. And the reality is not this. We're filled in images of media with this kind of perception of modern family life, these wonderful evenings where everything has been put away and we have time on our hands to sit and read The Wheels on the Bus with the children. And of course, they are delighted, even if they're not interested in the book, they're constantly showing their love and adoration to us. And that may be your experience of modern family life, but it's not been mine. And even if it has been mine, those kind of moments have not lasted so long. And this probably is a little bit closer to the reality that I think many of us are dealing with. It's complex, it's messy, it's full of energy, and in some ways it's still wonderful. But it's not the picture that I have shown before.
Excuse me, David, I just want to make sure you know that we can't see your screen at the moment.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
Well, that's so you probably didn't. So let me just try and share my screen again.
Yeah, so now we can see your screen with all our faces.
Okay.
So that's fine, but if you have a presentation to show.
Okay, so
that should be to another one, I think.
Can you see the picture? Yes. Okay, perfect. So this was the picture I was showing of the beautiful family. This is not me.
No, we don't see. Excuse me, David. We cannot see your slides. We see the pictures of the participants.
Okay.
It takes some time, before. Yes. So now. Okay. So I still don't see your presentation. Does anyone see David's presentation or David's slides?
No.
No.
So.
Okay. So then we're going to do it. Then we're going to try and do it in a different way, because so I'd rather see you then. So I'm gonna look at you guys, and I'm going to tell you about the pictures that I was showing you, because so the first picture I was showing you was of a wonderful family sitting on a sofa with their kids looking adoringly up at their parents while they were reading The Wheels on the Bus. That's not modern family life. The reality of modern family life is complex, messy. It's one of those things that in some ways I think its beauty is in its complexity. And the reality is that for me, the reality is that that there is this sense that it's always been complex, and then COVID-19 came along and made it even more complicated. And I think it added another dimension. And I know, speaking to many parents about kind of the kinds of experiences we had, that it added, extra complexity. And one of the things I was going to share with you was there was a US report, just because I think it adds something if you add a report from the US into a presentation. But here's just 2 or 3 statistics. 27% of parents have reported worsening mental health for themselves over the last 12 months. 14% of parents say that their children's behaviours have got worse, and 24% are struggling with issues of childcare. And so these are some of the things that an already complicated situation has been made more complicated. And so one of the things I'd like to do now is just pause for a second and maybe get some feedback from you. You can unmute yourself. This is your moment to share some of your story. And the question is really simple. As you look back over the last 12 months, what are some of the challenges that you have felt? And conversely, maybe you've spotted, in terms of modern family life, maybe there are some opportunities that have given rise to themselves. It's not all been bad, and I think this is one of the things that we've noticed, is that it's yes, things have become more complicated, but there have been some silver linings. Try and keep your answers nice and succinct, otherwise there won't be time for this wonderful presentation of slides that you're not going to see. So anyone want to kick us off with a challenge or an opportunity as you look back over the last 12 months? If you would prefer to use the chat because you're a bit nervous about speaking out, or you can't find the unmute button, feel free to use the chat, and I'm looking at that now.
David, just let me know if you want me to be an icebreaker.
Oh, well, Eleanor, you kick us off.
Okay, good. So indeed, I don't have 6 children, but I still have 3 children at home. And I think the first challenge I met from one day to the other when we were forced into that lockdown is to come to the conclusion that for a few weeks, I would be the mother, the teacher, the housekeeper, all those things that I never thought would be so complicated to do. So at one hand, it helped me having a lot of respect and recognition for all those persons that do support our lives on a daily basis. But at the same time, I was feeling really, really unpowerful, if that's the correct English word. So that was my challenge. I think the opportunity was to have no other choice than spending time with your family and then finding out how to do that on the best way. It wasn't every day as easy, but it was an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's something we hear quite often, isn't it? That sense of the roles of being a parent. That in some ways we'd got used to understanding that being a parent was this in the morning, this after school, and this at weekends. Suddenly, we were those roles and those lines of responsibilities were blurring quite rapidly, and we had to get used to that. Were other people seeing other challenges or opportunities?
I think someone is trying. Malcolm, are you talking, right? But we can't hear you. But I would love to know what you're saying. Yes, maybe your mic is not well connected. You're not on mute, so that's fine. But maybe there is something with your computer. If you prefer, you can add something in the chat box and I will read it loud.
No. Okay, well, the point...
I can share something.
Yes, yes.
Just sharing my experience with a teenager. And at the very start of this COVID situation with lockdown, we decided to focus on routines, because I could see that things would be a bit different, and we decided to stick to the routine of getting up in the morning, taking a shower, changing, not sitting around in our pajamas for too long, and just pacing ourselves through the day gently and doing what we need to do when we need to do it, mealtime, and so on. And that has helped in a way. We're lucky because we have a dog as well, so that keeps us very much on track. And that was grounding in a sense. But now it's been going on for too long, and we're missing out on the social connections, especially the teenagers. Social media cannot replace the face-to-face interactions and going out and with lockdown. So I'm wondering what advice you can give at this stage of COVID, while the routine carried us nicely for many months, but now it's a bit exhausting, I have to say.
I think that's a great summary of what so many of us have felt about this. I'm one of the things I've been quite interested in over the last year is to understand almost the wavelength of COVID-19. And what I mean by that is that when we approach a crisis, we typically have that sense of, we can do this, it's full of energy, and we throw everything into it. And we saw, let's say in a lot of schools, for example, this huge sense of we're going to conquer this and we're going to respond quickly. And then one of the problems of a crisis is that you don't always know how long it's going to be. And so there's been some research around this that suggests that one of the things that we most struggle with as human beings is that we know things are going to get more complicated before they resolve themselves again, and we move from simple to complicated to simple again. The problem is we don't know where we are along that line, and so we think at a certain point, maybe back in April, that things have got really complicated and they're going to be better by the summer. And what we realize is that actually by the summer and then the autumn, they got more complicated, and that where we thought we were heading out of a crisis, maybe in April, May time, the reality was that we were only just beginning. Rather than being the beginning of the end, this was the end of the beginning. And I think this is, for us as humans, this is something that we really struggle with, is to know how long something is going to be, and has been a real challenge. That doesn't necessarily help us manage it, but I do think one of the things that you mentioned is this idea of routines, and I know that that those routines are certainly something that is very. I've just noticed my screen has. I can't see you anymore, and yes. I can see someone's screen.
And we can see your screen now.
That's unbelievable.
But not the presentation, just the screen.
I'm not sure that's my screen. I actually think that may be Bernard's screen, because I can see his email at the top left. Bernard, I think you're sharing your screen.
Yes.
Yeah, Bernard, we can see your email.
Yeah.
You need to turn your screen sharing off. We've got another comment here as Bernard.
Okay, good. Good. I see a question on the chat box.
So yeah, this idea of helping for shopping for the
yes.
for the first time. This is a change in our relationship from being parents who organize everything to having your grown-up children start to look after you. An insight into what will inevitably come later in our retirement. Well, Malcolm, it's interesting you say that, because I actually think that you don't have to be a retiree to feel that shift. So I turned 50 during the COVID crisis, and one of the things that I began to realize, is that suddenly my younger children were in a position where they were, in some ways, because of they were less likely to be impacted by COVID. In a sense, they became the carers for me, and I noticed myself that, you know, I was less. They would go shopping for me, or they would make sure that, you know, Dad stayed at home, etc. So in some ways, I think this is an interesting dynamic as well. Whether it's an opportunity or a challenge, is the opportunity for me was actually one of thinking, here's a way in which my children now are expressing their care for me as an adult, because they saw in some ways a sense of a risk that was associated with my simply being older and having asthma, for example. And I know that one of the opportunities that we found as a family, linking to some of the things that has been said already, the routines for sure were important. And one of the things that I know that my own daughter said at one point when I asked her what she'd learned through distance learning and through working at school, she said, you know, I used to be in a point where I would do anything as a teenager to leave the house and go and be with my friends. And actually, because I couldn't do that, I began to appreciate more being around the family, cooking together, having time in this moment together. And I feel that in some ways we have become closer as a family because of our distance from other people. But what I want to do, and again, I've got some crib notes here now on which you would have seen, and we'll share these afterwards. One of the things that I'm asking about all of this situation to myself is, how do we make sense of it all? You know, how are we going to look back and make sense of this? Modern family life is complicated enough, and then COVID comes along. And I'm going to just share with you 5 ideas very briefly in 5 minutes that actually come from philosophy and other great thinkers. And because sometimes I think that we make sense of these micro stories that we're all living by looking beyond that, and maybe it's the philosopher in me that is kind of looking for wisdom and advice from some great thinking traditions. So I'm going to start with Socrates, and many of you will recognize this. And the bit of wisdom that I want to share with you is, the more we know, the less we know. In other words, the more that we have, the more I become a parent, the longer I am a parent, I would say the less I know about what good parenting really is, the less I know. And I think what I mean by that is, sometimes I think at the beginning of our time as a parent, you know, I remember when my first son Jack was born, I thought I knew it all. I thought I had it all. And then, as now he is 25, and I realize, you know, 6 children later, that really I don't know much about being a parent. But that's okay, because that's where wisdom comes from. Often it comes from learning that you probably don't know as much as you once thought you did. Another piece of advice actually comes from a pediatric doctor called Winnicott, who was famous for several ideas around human growth and development, particularly child growth and development. And I would capture it in the phrase, good enough is good enough. And so one of the modern tendencies about parenting, and you may have heard the term helicopter parenting, it's basically where we all hover over our children, trying to make sure that they're absolutely fine all of the time, is that we have this idea that we've got to be perfect, and we've got to fill our children's lives with wonderful experience and quality time and extra homework opportunities that will make them happy, successful, ethical human beings when they've left home. And one of the things that Winnicott is telling us and reminding us is that the best you can be as a parent is good enough. In other words, as I like to say, if you survive, it's probably okay. And what Winnicott is encouraging us to see is that good enough is good enough, and that there are many things that make up a good life, and being a good enough parent is probably the best we can imagine and hope for as we move through this crisis. And I think one of the things I like about Winnicott's ideas is that it removes what I see very often as the huge guilt of parenting that many of us struggle with. And I think many of us will look back on this time of COVID with a sense of guilt. Were we there enough? Did we do enough? Were we present enough? Did we get that, the Wi-Fi set up enough? What Winnicott is saying is, if it was good enough, then that's good enough. Another idea. This comes from Alain de Botton, famous writer, novelist, but increasingly kind of philosophical commentator on society. He talks about this idea that there is more to childhood than school. And in fact, what he says is, if we only gave children more time to reflect on and analyze and make sense of their childhood as they're living it, it would save them a lot of therapy as they're growing up. And that the biggest thing that children need to do as a child is actually make sense of their own childhood. And one of the things that reminds me is that I have a friend called David Gleason, who's an author in the United States, and he's just written a book called At What Cost? And one of the things he talks about is this idea of overschooling or hyperschooling. And he says that one of the things we've done in modern family life is to fill our children's agenda with more and more and more. And we are hyperschooling them. They go to school, they have after school activities, they have Saturday experiences, they have Sunday homework days. And for him, what he's saying, and I think what Alain de Botton is leading us to think about, is how much space are we giving our children simply to be children and to make sense of the experiences that they're going through. And I do think that in some strange way, and certainly looking at my own family, that there is a way in which COVID has actually enabled some of that space to emerge, because there has been less to do for children and they've had more time to reflect. Another idea, this is the most controversial of the five. David Perkins, Harvard professor, he famously said a few years ago, 90% of what we teach in schools is not worth learning. And this is the same kind of idea that when we think about what it means to be a good parent and to be a good school, that one of the things we're doing is having to think about how much of what is happening right now is going to be relevant for our children going forward. And one of the ways in which I'd like to think about this is to think about what is going to be sticky for our children in the future. As parents, as schools, and so much of my time is working in a school as well, what is going to stick? When they're 40 years old and I ask my son, look back on your life, your childhood, what sticks? I guarantee that my son will not say what is sticking is my IB results. I guarantee my child is not going to say what sticks is the fact that I had this after school activity every day of the week. What will stick will be those other moments, those in-between moments, that sense of care, that sense of the teacher that had that kind word, the confidence that is left by people. And a lot of it will be linked to relationships. And I've asked that question to my older children several times, and also to many of our alumni who've graduated from the school. And most of them are talking about moments, teachers, places, and fabulous memories that are not associated with some of the traditional things that we think are important. My last point here, before we play another little game, and this actually was a word of wisdom, not from a great philosopher or thinker, but he was a great thinker. And it actually was from a therapist when I worked in a psychiatric hospital many years ago. And I was talking to him about being a father, a new father, and he said to me one thing which stuck with me. He said, David, you need to remember, a parent is for life, not just for childhood. And one of the things that shows me about modern family life is that we tend as parents to have a frame of reference which says our job is to get children to 18 or 21 beyond college, and then we're done. And what he said is that actually being a parent is a lifetime of work. I will be a parent to my children when my children are 30 and 40 and 50, however long I live. And one of the things that I've often reflected on and at times written about is this idea that every one of us, if you break up the stages of being a parent, every one of us will have moments where we excel as being parents and some moments where we're really not that good, where we're gurus or where we're quite rookie-ish. And so, for example, you may have been a parent that was quite wonderful at getting up and doing the midnight shift, the feeding, or you might have been great at homework, or you might have been great at reading bedtime stories, or coping with moody teenagers, or helping advise someone through the choice of a career. The fact is we can't be good at all of those things, and maybe over time we learn that we are good at some things as parents and less good at others. We have someone else, Christina, I think, who's now sharing her screen. So those are 5 ideas, and I'm just throwing these things out for us to think about. And I'm going to play a game with you now. And one of the things that I'd like you to think about is this idea of, so how has it been for you over the last year? And make a little mental note. I'm going to read out a series of things that you may have said to yourself or your children may have said to you over the last year, and you're going to get 1 point for every time that you've said this to yourself or your child has said this to you. And I'm going to give you the first example, and we're going to see how many points people have in this game. So the first one is, my child isn't talking to me right now. If you've over the last 12 months had a moment where your child isn't talking to you, give yourself a point. The second one, my child isn't reading enough. If you've thought my child isn't reading enough, give yourself a point. Third, I shouldn't have reacted like that. If you thought that, give yourself a point. Fourth, will they get into the right college now? If you thought that, give yourself a point. Fifth, did I ruin my child's life by moving here? Next one, I feel like I'm not a very good parent after all. Next one, I should have more quality time with my children. Next one, my child has far too much screen time. Next one, does my child have enough or the right kinds of friends? Next one, tomorrow my child needs an early night. Next one, I didn't behave like this when I was a child. And then there's an opportunity finally to see, this could be a tiebreaker. If someone has another bonus thought that you think deserves a point, think about what that might be and give yourself a bonus point. So I'm just wondering how many points people got, and you can put it into the chat or you can shout it out. Okay, we've got Sharon. It's got full marks. Congratulations, Sharon. 7, 8, 9s. These are like badges of honor coming out here. So this is the reality of modern family life. So I'm curious, did anyone get 0? Here's the point. Here's the point: is that, you know, the reality is, as we try and make sense of modern family life and make sense of what's happened over the last 12 months, we've been sitting locked in our houses, in a sense, all feeling roughly the same thing, and maybe that means that some of the wise words of the philosophers can give us some perspective. But also one of the things that we can do, I think, is connect with one another and share stories in ways that actually help bring out this reality for people. Someone else is sharing their screen now. Everybody can share their screen, it seems, but me, which is kind of ironic. But you know, that's the way it is today. But and I'm going to pick up on this idea of people can share by sharing a story. It's kind of like it's halving the pain, I think. And I'll give you an example of this. So a few years ago, many years ago, actually now, my son. One of my sons actually had a situation where for 1 year he refused to go to school, and he woke up one day and he basically said, "I'm not going to school." I thought that was just a kind of early preteen stand, and it turns out that he actually had something that I didn't know existed. He had something called school refusal disorder, and I began quickly to understand that this was not him being petulant, but this was something that went very deep within him, and he physically couldn't go to school. And so that meant that I decided, and over time we went through a process, and he ended up working through that. We worked through that as a family, and he went back to school after 1 year. But what we did, he and I together, is we decided to write up that story of that from the perspective of myself as his dad, and his story of not going to school for 1 year, and how he felt as a 13-year-old boy. And we published it in various places and newspapers. And to this day, and we're now 12, 13 years later, we still occasionally get people writing to us who found these articles and stories on the internet, because it seems that suddenly it connected us to a whole group of people that we didn't even know existed. There are 6,000 kids in the school who are school refusers in the UK right now. And yet this is something that we didn't even know we were part of such a large community of people or families struggling with these things. And the point is that I think that many of the things that we are feeling ourselves are shared with other people. And that as we tell these stories in truthful and honest ways, it can actually help us think about, you know, the fact that we're not alone. And in fact, we are being, in many cases, there's a normalcy that arises. And so we try to tell stories to one another to make sense of the situation that we're in. I'm gonna give you a few examples, though, of 2 or 3 examples of how difficult. And someone is still sharing their screen, and I don't know whether that's you. Have a look out there. I'm seeing myself here. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the funny ways in which kids make sense of their own childhood and life as they grow up. And one of the things I did for many years was collect these little sense-making stories that my kids spoke about when they were growing up, because it kind of shows how sweet and innocent but complicated life can be when you're trying to make sense of it. Here's just a couple of examples. This is Leia on the subject of pulling strings. She came home and she said, "Daddy, can your boss chuck kids out of school? Because if he can, I have a name for him, someone who's been really mean to me today." So I thought, okay, I can see you trying to make sense of what I do and how important my boss is. Here's another one, Juliet, on how bad the Belgian weather is. "Mummy, I wish I was an omelette. It would be so warm in that pan." You might begin to think that my children are just plain weird, but believe me, it's the parenting. Here's another one, Leia on modern travel. "Look, Daddy, you aren't allowed to brush your teeth on this plane." And I'm going to have to show you this because I don't know whether you can see this. Everyone else thinks it's no smoking, but my daughter looked at it and realized that it was it's actually prohibited to brush your teeth once the engine starts on the plane. So and one last one, because I work in an international school and I'm proud of the international education that my children receive. Juliet on cultural diversity. "Daddy, I learned all about Sweden today. I learned that they all buy their biscuits from IKEA." And if that's not a great education, then I don't know what is. So the point is, it's not easy to make sense of it. It's not easy as a child. It's not easy as an adult. So we're gonna begin to kind of draw our conversation today to a conclusion, and I'm going to throw out one more question that I'd like you to either unmute yourselves, share your screens as you're doing, or put it in the chat. And here's the quiz question. Looking back to a younger you, in other words, February 2020, what advice on family life would you offer yourself? If you know now, if you knew then what you know now, just under a year ago, what advice would you offer yourself? But choose a few important things with or for each child. I think that's a great. I think that power of that power of selectivity and focus is really important. To be patient and remember, family is the greatest treasure in this fast-changing world. I think one of the things that we found, in my experience, is that you have to learn to relax into something. You have to learn to relax into being in lockdown. It's a bit like learning to relax on holiday. If you're like me, you go on holiday and the first 3 or 4 days, you're kind of hyperactive because your body is not used to that relaxation, and it takes a while to get into that rhythm. Not to take things for granted and to mindfully appreciate the little things in life that are not available in lockdown. I think again, there are so many things now that, in my experience, I'm going to appreciate those little moments that, you know, once this is over, in ways that I would never have done before. Work hard on routine breakers. Yeah. Things that provide those little opportunities. One of the things I did was learn how to make jam, and over this period, and I'd never made jam before, and maybe once this is all over, maybe I'll never make it again. But I've become quite obsessed by making jam, and and we've as a family, we've had dinners together where we've traveled to different parts of the world by cooking food from different parts of the world. So we've been to Peru, we've been to India, we've been to Spain and Italy, of course, France, of course, but we've traveled all over the world just by sitting at our dinner table. And it's been quite fun to see how those dinner times grew into something more than just food. We started dressing, we started putting playlists from different parts of the world, etc. Yeah, and this idea of self-care, I think one of the things I know that I spend a lot of time talking to my colleagues about and the team that work with me is the need for being able to shift the gears and see this very much as a marathon rather than a sprint. And recently at the end of the year, I did a review of the year for schools, and one of the things I said there was, the irony is back in March, we all told each other as schools, this is a marathon and not a sprint, but we sprinted anyway. And this is our natural tendency to approach these type of crises. And as parents as well, as members of families, learning how to do this for a marathon rather than a sprint, I think is really interesting. So one of the things I would encourage you to do, and I've got two more thoughts here, is use the opportunity that we have, which may never, and in some ways, God forbid it ever happens again, but this may never happen again, to have different kinds of conversations with your kids. And maybe because we've been in lockdown, maybe because they feel sorry for me as a aging 50-something-year-old man. One of the things that I've been able to do is actually have different conversations with my own children, particularly about the what and the how and the why of their learning. And through that period of lockdown, I have had several moments where I have actually interviewed my own children, partly because they were a captive audience, but to understand what it was that they were learning. And I'll give you one example of an early interview I did, and 8 things I learned from them, just from that one interview. 1, they are taking their learning seriously. Whatever we think, they are taking this seriously. 2, they have an increased and profound sense of gratitude for their school. 3, they have all lost something. They haven't necessarily lost relatives or big things. They have had little losses, but they do matter. 4, real learning is taking place in the spaces in between structured lessons. And I saw that very, very clearly for my own children, that the real learning wasn't the Zoom session. It was what was happening in between. 5, learning is more effective when the pace is slowed. 6, social distancing has led to a greater sense of family. 7, success is defined in terms of autonomy and self-control. How much control and autonomy the kids felt about how they could organize themselves and pivot in relation to this crisis for their own, and advocate for themselves during the course of this process was important for them. And the final piece that I think was challenging for me as a parent, the 8th piece of knowledge here, was that they told me fear is never far away. And that was really important for me to understand that and hear the fact that even if they were teasing their old dad about not going to the delays, that there was a sense of fear that was underpinning their experience of this. So before we open up for 5 minutes of last questions and a wrap up, I've got one more thought. And this actually comes from another thinker, a man called Taleb. And he wrote a book called Antifragility. And this was a book that I read during the lockdown and found it very profoundly insightful. And this idea of anti-fragility is basically this. He said there are certain things that when you put them under stress, they don't break, but they actually get stronger. And he uses the example of a muscle. Under certain kinds of stress, within limits, a muscle will get stronger the more stress that you put on it. And one of the things that I've been thinking about over this period is about schools and how they are anti-fragile. They don't break, but they may have got stronger. But I also believe that that is true of modern families. That for many of us, the pressure, the stress, the change, the complicated nature of our lives as we're living them now may actually be making our families stronger, even if a bit like going to the gym, it causes us to sweat a little along the way. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to hand back to Eleanor. There may be chance for 5 minutes of questions, some thoughts. You might want to put something in the chat, but I apologize that for me, the technology, obviously reaching 50 means that technology doesn't work for me anymore, but I hope that in some way that we've had an opportunity just to pause and reflect on how we're doing, and the fact that in the end, good enough is probably going to be good enough.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And I actually think that seeing faces, it's much more important nowadays than seeing any other kind of screen. So yes, so if anyone still has questions or remarks, we still have a couple of minutes. I would like to close the meeting by 10 so we can respect everyone's schedule and routine or other activities of the day. But if you have questions, just speak them out loud or drop them in the chat box. Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing Winnicott to this discussion and his thoughts on good is good enough. And perhaps what we are also doing at the moment is modeling to our children our own imperfections and how we can accept them and work through them. And we're modeling to them how to cope in these unprecedented times. And the thought that Winnicott shared about creating a perfect environment is in fact depriving our children from learning to cope and to be resilient and to be at peace with one's failings and mistakes and imperfections, and to just get up and try again and try different and be resourceful. So I really appreciate you mentioning it, because it turns things round and charges the batteries as parents. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection. I do think one of the things that it may be doing, you talked about modeling for children. I've been quite interested in the last few days about, again, talking to my children about how this experience is going to change the kind of schools that they will choose for their children when they have children of that age in 10, 20 years' time. And I do believe that there are things happening right now that are changing the criteria in their brains and the DNA of their decision making for them. And it could be that alongside this, a real sense of, you know, other aspects of their DNA, their mental map is changing. It's interesting that there's Elizabeth writes on the chat around you know, her child being an adult, but one of the things that we haven't talked about, of course, here is the fact of you know, many of us still have our own older parents, and the way in which my relationship with my parents has changed over the last year. Give you one example. I have phoned my parents pretty much every day on video for the last year, and it's become a routine where we've ended up eating together with the screen at the end of the table. That would never have happened without this, and I felt very blessed in the sense that it's changed the relationship with my 70-something year old parents. Malcolm's put the just a link to reference to CHS, and I would just say that, you know, if you don't know CHS, many of you will, of course, that I do think that services like this are really important and critical when things get tougher. We've been talking about that sense of, you know, making sense of things within a range, but there are times when you can't make sense of it, and things begin to crumble and fragment in ways that you can't put the pieces back together. And I do think that CHS and organizations like them provide this remarkable service for supporting people when they're really at the edge of coping. So it looks as though we've reached, Eleanor, our 10 o'clock deadline. So I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for joining. I enjoyed it a lot, and I see from the reactions that was insightful and to the point for many persons in our situation and in the audience. We will be looking forward to welcoming you to the next session that will be held next month, the third Thursday of the month. You will be receiving the recording of this session and the invite to the next session very, very soon. Have a good day all. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.